had a good lunch. It wasn't too bad at all. I think in the days when we came for the previous seminar here, there were obviously a lot more visitor numbers. So I think I'm working off the right sheet. I'm working off the sheet you have. But rather than that be perfect, and we are volunteers, if you remember, then we do have an incorrect speaker name on this one. Yes. We're going for the spot the deliberate mistakes, except they're not. You know, as I say, we are volunteers. We do this in our spare time, and you're all volunteers with many things. There isn't much spare time usually. So we're joined now by John Casey, who is very, very new to the National Archives. He's only been here since July of the last year. He's recently graduated from the University of Exeter with a degree in history and has been working as a cataloguer at the National Archives since July, as I said originally. Prior to beginning his work on the MH106 in January this year, so that is really new, he worked on the Arabian Gulf Digital Archive project, cataloguing records relating to the UAE and the Arabian Gulf. He doesn't say in his bio if he had to go and examine the ground, perhaps we can ask him that later. He's particularly interested in memory and commemoration of the First World War, and he's very keen about the possibilities of this project and enthusiastic to share it with us. So over to John. Thank you very much.
Hello, yeah, I'm John. Hopefully I can be a worthy substitute for David, who's not able to join us today. So I'm just going to give a brief outline of the talk. We're going to go through what is the MH106 series, give a background to the series. I'm going to talk about the aims of the MH106 project, what are we doing and why are we doing it. I'm going to go through some interesting records and examples, give you an idea of the kind of records we're working with. I'm going to also talk about the challenges, some of the challenges we face as cataloguers, and we're going to look at some outcomes and plans for the future. So, MH106 is a collection of First World War servicemen's medical records, so collected by the Medical Research Committee and Advisory Council, which was a precursor to the Medical Research Council. It was used by the Ministry of Pensions for pensions for servicemen who were wounded during the war and needed a pension afterwards. And it was used to compile the history of the Great War based on official documents. It contains medical case sheets, admission and discharge registers, medical index cards, and medical board reports. So there's quite a wide range of record in here. We're not cataloguing all of them. We're focusing on medical case sheets and the index cards. What we have here in MH106 is a representative sample of approximately 3.5%. Now, what makes it representative, we're not entirely sure. We don't actually have the information that tells us how they decided what was and what wasn't representative, but we've got a lot of different types of condition from different units. I've found in the past 6 weeks already soldiers who served most fronts. The only fronts I haven't found soldiers from are the Italian front in 1918 and the East African front. And this is partly part of the reason we don't really know much about how it was collected is that the confused legacy in the way in which it was collected. So it was collected throughout the war and during the war, and the way it was collected changed based upon how the Medical Research Committee needed the records, so based upon what medics needed. So it was initially collected by condition, it was then collected by regiment, and then it was also collected by hospitals. So we end up having volumes that are just completely disparate, and that's part of the reason why we're cataloguing it, because as for researchers, when you go onto Discovery, you just find a volume based on hospital. We don't know who's in it, we don't know what the dates are. So yeah, we end up having a confused and slightly misleading archive. So the MH106 project itself, generously funded by the Wellcome Trust, which is, I think, the world's leading medical science and humanities research charity. And so what we're doing is we're cataloguing the medical case sheets and medical index cards to item level. So they'll be searchable on Discovery. You'll be able to search by name, date, rank. You'll be able to search by the condition, the hospitals that they've been treated at. So it's also a significant bank of names. It's a very name-rich source. We've got, in the index cards, we have approximately 24,000 individual cases, and we have approximately 100,000 individual cases in the medical case sheets. So this is obviously really important for finding names, particularly as a result of some of the it will add names that we don't potentially have as a result of records being destroyed. It's obviously really useful for the medical humanities and social science research. So it will give us a lot of detail about cases that we don't necessarily have easily accessible. And also we'll be able to link it with other records. So we'll be able to link this with the 1911 census. When the 1921 census comes out, we'll be able to see some of the outcomes of the patients that we see in the collection, whether they survived, whether they would get a pension, whether or not they're actually be able to go back to work after the war. So there's a lot of potential. And this is an example of what it's going to look like on Discovery. So we've already released the first 14,000 individuals on Discovery. We released those last Friday, and the plan is to release them as we go. So as we catalogue and as we do our quality assurance, we'll then be releasing them over the next few years. So this is Lance Corporal George Askew from the Lincolnshire Regiment. So we're now going to look at some of the records themselves. So I'll start with the index cards. So these are some of our most basic records. They just give us simple information, the name, the rank, the unit, what their condition was, no further details, just what it was, and where they were treated. So this individual is Gunner J. Andrews of the Royal Field Artillery, and he's come in with myalgia. He was initially treated at the number 5 field ambulance. And we've also got his field medical card. So this would be given to a soldier at the close to the front line. So field ambulances were one of the furthest forward medical units. So that's quite interesting to have that there. And also to mention, for the medical index cards, we've got the ones that survive, we've got the Leicestershire Regiment and the Royal Field Artillery. And we've also got medical case sheets. So these are the bulk of the information that we're getting down is from medical case sheets. These are the records that we'll be most looking at. We've got about 275 volumes in this series, and currently this phase of the project will be cataloguing about 160 of them. We're not necessarily able to catalogue all of them just yet due to resources, but also because some of them, the dates are from 1919, so we're not able to release those yet. And so these, again, like the medical index cards, contain simple information, so name, rank, unit, condition. We've got regimental number, hospitals, and the dates. But they've also got a lot more detail about the kind of treatment that a soldier would have been receiving. So this will tell us where they were treated, what if they had any procedures, if they had operations or X-rays, what medications they were given. It will tell us if they were transferred, the dates they were transferred, and it will give us an outcome. So we'll see if they were sent back to the front line. They might have been discharged on sick furlough. They might have been discharged permanently unfit, and usually we can get this information from a medical case sheet. Other interesting information we can get includes civil occupation, home address, next of kin address, religion, and sometimes previous medical treatment and history. This is particularly interesting when we have pre-war medical history and treatment. And sometimes you get the location and circumstances of wounding. So yesterday I found an artilleryman who was wounded on the 2nd of July 1916. So that's the day after the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and he was wounded at the Hohenzollern Redoubt, which is an area of extremely heavy fighting during the Battle of the Somme. So yeah, there's lots of information crammed in. So I'm going to look at a few examples just to give you an idea of what exactly the detail it covers. And I've got here, just to give you an example of what the case sheets look like, the header of a case sheet of Lance Corporal William Scotney. He was in the 2nd, 5th Leicesters, and he was shot, and we believe he was shot during the Easter Rising. He was admitted, I think, 5 or 6 days after the rebellion began, and as it says, Irish Rebellion there. We don't have any more information, but I think it's fairly reasonable to assume that that was what he was involved in. So that's really interesting, bit of information that's recorded there. I've got another example of a medical case sheet. So most medical case sheets are handwritten, as you can see. This one has quite a lot of detail here, so I'm going to talk you through it. This is Private Harold Payne, 7th Battalion, the Royal Leicestershire Regiment, and he was a prisoner of war, and he was repatriated. We're not sure when, but he was admitted to hospital in December 1918. And his case sheet says that he was admitted in an extreme state of emaciation, so he's not had very much to eat. He spent 7 months, he had endured 7 months of deprivation and starvation in Germany. So he's very unwell when he comes in. He has severe gastrointestinal symptoms, and we find out that he's been treated with, amongst other things, opium. But unfortunately, he came in such a sorry state that he died on the 1st of January 1919. But what this does give us, as well as a bit of a sad story, very sad story, it gives us some fascinating detail and a glimpse of the experience of prisoners of war. Obviously, Germany, by this time, by 1918, there would not have been very much food at all, definitely not much to spare for prisoners of war. So we get a little bit of a sense of that just from his medical case sheet. Here's just to give you an idea of what as cataloguers we're seeing. So we've got the spreadsheet. I think it's fairly straightforward, but I've enlarged an example just to show you of Gunner Albert Smith of the Royal Field Artillery. So he came in suffering with trench fever and back pain. And he was originally admitted to the number 13 General Hospital in Boulogne in France, and the first date we have for him is he was admitted to the Duchess of Connaught Canadian Red Cross Hospital on the Cliveden Estate on the 10th of November 1916. So we include just a few details. This case is actually very interesting. It's got some information about his family, which I'll talk about in just a bit. So you just get a sense of we give a little bit of information. And this will all be available on Discovery, so you'll have a small paragraph about the details. He was discharged on sick furlough in December 1916. And so if we just take a look at Private Smith's case sheet, gives us some extra information about his family. So you can see what this tells us is his father and mother, 3 brothers and 3 sisters are alive and well. 1 sister's died of tuberculosis and 1 sister's died of acute rheumatism. But most interestingly, we can see 1 brother was killed in Egypt on active service, 1 was killed on the Somme on active service, and 1 brother was wounded at Arras. So it's a large family that has been affected by the war. It's a good example of the kind of extra detail you get. At Cliveden, we see other examples of this medical officer, and he tends to give family information. So you don't always get family information, but when you do, it's just exciting. It's just interesting to think about their family as well as just the individual. It's not just a name, it's not just a dry statistic. So I'd like to talk now about some of the conditions and injuries that we come across. So we see what has been described as the signature injuries of the First World War, shell shock, neurasthenia, gas poisoning. We see trench foot, trench fever. These often appear in winter in particular. You see gunshot and shrapnel wounds. You see lots of those, very infected as well. Some tropical illnesses, malaria and dysentery. We see a lot of people coming from Salonika suffering from malaria and dysentery. Occasionally recurring sometimes, they'll have 10 attacks of malaria during their service. And then some more everyday conditions as well. Things like appendicitis, influenza, things that you wouldn't necessarily get from war service, things that we get now. And then we've also got venereal diseases, soldiers had those, hernias, and then particularly in the Royal Field Artillery, we see kicks from horses. People they'll be grooming a horse and they'll get kicked, sometimes with disastrous consequences. So I see upwards of 10, 15 in every volume from the Royal Field Artillery, people who have been brought back to the UK from being kicked. And then inevitably, football-related injuries. One chap was kicked in the knee while playing football in France, and this exacerbated a blood clot in his knee and rendered him incapable of service, and he was sent back to the UK. As shows it's not just current footballers who can take a knock rather badly, as could happen as well 100 years ago. So as well as handwritten case sheets, we've got typed medical case sheets. These are quite rare. They don't come up very often, but they often indicate a full write-up after the event. So they'll give us some extra detail, and they're also very nice as cataloguers for us to read, because everything's there plainly. The case I've got here is a very interesting one, probably the most interesting case that I've come across so far, and this is Private William James Smith. He was admitted suffering with neurasthenia, which at that time was a term to denote some kind of mental injury, used somewhat interchangeably with shell shock. So he was admitted with neurasthenia after witnessing the death of his brother in the front line. So he was serving with the 7th Leinster Regiment, who at this time was serving in the region of the Somme. But Private Smith's injury occurred prior to the Battle of 1916. It occurred in May 1916, and he witnessed his brother killed by the explosion of a grenade. And what his case sheet details is he seems to suffer from some kind of nervous breakdown as a result. So I've enlarged some particularly interesting detail. I hope it's visible. So when he's brought in, he is continually asking for his brother. It appears that he's unsure whether or not his brother has actually been killed, and it seems that he believes his brother is in the hospital with him. And we're even told that he rushed at his captain and sergeant major and attempted to kill them. So a man is seriously traumatized by what he's seen, and he's also threatening suicide. So there's a lot of detail about the experience, about their symptoms, which is really fascinating in this case, really quite sad, quite emotional. We also get information about his previous medical history. So Private Smith, when he was a child, was institutionalized for hitting another boy. When he was 6, he was put in for 3 months. And when he was a teenager, he suffered from something called falling sickness. We're not sure what that could be. It appears his mother suffered from it as well. And he seems to, or it was believed that he was cured by a priest with a relic. So we've got some social and religious insights as well. It's really fascinating. I think, I don't know, it's just so interesting to see this detail, you know, that a priest, I just try to imagine it. Yeah, fascinating. Can't put it into words. We've also got a handwritten note for Private Smith. So this was by Captain Stewart, the 7th Battalion Medical Officer, and was written, it gives us some details of the actual circumstances of his admission. So what this note tells us is he was brought in under guard, and he was biting sandbags and hitting trench walls as he was being dragged back away from the front line. Captain Stewart also tells us that he was unable to recognise comrades. He was unable to recognise the medical officer, despite the fact that Captain Stewart was well known to Private Smith. So I think this is a really powerful story. We find out, you know, exactly what the details, the circumstances. We find out what his experiences are during treatment, and we also get some previous medical history as well. So really comprehensive, and it'll be fascinating to see what became of Private Smith once the 1921 census records are released. What happened to him during the war is he was treated in the UK and he was discharged as permanently unfit for service in January 1917. We know his records tell us that he got better, he became calmer, he was able to communicate, recognize people, but eventually it was decided that he was unfit for service and he was discharged. Also just going to talk through now some examples of other kinds of records that we get in the collection. So here's a clinical chart. This gives us some basic information, as do the other records, name, rank, occasionally the hospital, but not always, and dates of admission. And this tells us the temperature. So it's just an interesting visual. We can see this individual's temperature was above normal. It's just a little bit of extra information. We've also got discharge notices, fairly self-explanatory. This is for driver H.J. McAdams of the Royal Field Artillery. He was sent back to rejoin his unit. And we've also got hospital-specific documents. So we've got one here from the Beaufort War Hospital in Bristol, who make their own medical index cards. We've got a sheet from the Addington Park War Hospital in Croydon, which seems to have had a specialist department for gastrointestinal cases. So lots of servicemen come back from Salonika with malaria and dysentery, cases like that, and end up at Croydon. We've got case sheets from Norfolk as well. Norfolk comes up quite a lot, and also the Freemasons War Hospital in London. So this is interesting. It adds a little bit of flavour, adds a little bit of context to the documents we're looking at, and also shows that individual institutions were making their own forms, were supplying their own documents. Sometimes to get extra information, you get diet sheets, for example. So that gives us a little bit of an idea about the freedom with which these institutions were working during the war. We also get X-ray reports, so this is Private McAdams again, and these were written in request for an X-ray, and then also the results were written down on them. So we get details of fractures, we also get details of whether foreign bodies are within people's bodies, so things like shrapnel and bullets. You occasionally find after X-ray that someone has a piece of shrapnel lodged in them, or they've been shot and the bullet is still there. So these are really, really interesting records to see, and they're very actually widespread. So X-rays were not that old when the war broke out. They were only, I believe, 10 or 15 years old, and you could argue that the First World War sort of brought on the increased use of them. They were used so often because a lot of the injuries that medical officers were seeing on the Western Front, obviously broken bones, but then shrapnel from shells and other kinds of foreign bodies. So X-rays were crucial to treating the wounded during World War I. And an interesting fact, Marie Curie herself travelled around the Western Front and set up mobile X-ray units in hospitals, and sometimes worked with surgeons and radiographers, which is just a really interesting extra bit of detail. And occasionally, we get the X-rays themselves. So this is Private R.R. Joyner of the Royal East Kent Regiment, and he's been shot by a rifle bullet. He's been shot in the back. We don't know when, July 23rd, but we're not sure which year. And sadly, his case sheet doesn't tell us what happened to him, so it's not clear whether he died. But this is a very striking visual. Seeing it brings it very close to home. That's an uncomfortable image to look at. I'll also stress we don't get terribly many of these, but when we do, they usually tend to be very interesting. We also, more visuals, we get diagrams and sketches. So anatomical stamps seem to have been quite widely used, and they were annotated, often annotated for patients with tuberculosis and pneumonia and other injuries. Flesh wounds were annotated on them, and then sketches as well. So this sketch is from a burn. We can see the extent of the burn on the patient's foot. You get those quite often, actually. I found yesterday a quite artistic sketch of someone's scapular bone. It's just interesting to see. So what are some of the challenges that we come across at cataloguing MH106? So there's a lot of repetition of individuals and regimental numbers. So you will find 3 or 4 individuals with the same regimental number. You might find individuals that have different regimental numbers. They're loose papers in boxes. You have about 600-700 stacks of paper just in a box. They're not always in order. They tend to be in order, but not always. So that's quite challenging to work with. There's lots of medical and military abbreviations. Military ones are not as hard to work out. We have lists of those, but medical ones can be extremely difficult to work out. I have a history degree, not a medicine degree. And sometimes you will have, for example, just a letter indicating someone's condition. So this is really challenging. Sometimes we just don't know what that condition is. There's also a lot of contemporary medical terminology. For example, the word sinus is used to denote abscess. Sinuses obviously being a part of one's nose. We came across a chap who had issues with sinuses in his knees, and we spent some time trying to work out what that meant. What's a sinus is a hole. A hole, yes, exactly. So a hole or a space, yes, a cavity. So we worked out it was an abscess, or we hope it was an abscess, we believe. And that actually gets used quite often. So yeah, we've been able to corroborate that. So sinuses and abscesses, that's been quite confusing. There's also paleographic issues. So Dr. Scroll from 100 years ago, literally. And I thought I'd ask you guys if you can work out what these two are, what they. Yeah. Albuminuria is correct. I didn't think anyone would get that. I didn't know what it was at first. Albuminuria. It is, yeah. It's albumin in the urine. It's a symptom of kidney disease. Sorry, was anyone able to work out the top one? Otitis media. Okay. Well, you guys are much better at this than sometimes we are. Otitis media is an ear infection. Yeah, a middle ear infection, not very pleasant. Neither of these are particularly pleasant. None of the injuries tend to be. So I'd also like to talk about some of the additional content that's in MH106 that at the moment we're not cataloguing. We have 2,000 volumes of admission and discharge registers, and these contain approximately 1.3 million patients in them. So these are registers from medical units. So what we've got here is the admission and discharge register from the 51st Field Ambulance. Like I said, we're not cataloguing these, I'm afraid, but I do encourage you to come in and access these because they're extremely name-rich source. So please do come in and view them yourselves. We've also got medical board reports, and I'm mistaken, we are actually cataloguing these, so I do apologise. I found out today we're cataloguing medical board reports as well, and these are similar to case sheets, and what they detail is the proceedings of medical boards when a patient is discharged, and when they decide whether or not they're fit for service, and also whether patients were investigated for having inflicted the wounds upon themselves. So we are cataloguing those. I do apologise for that mistake. So I'd like to just think about some of the outcomes of the project. I hope I've shown that the records are really engaging and personal. We find out a lot of detail about individuals. Particularly I'm thinking of Private William Smith, who witnessed his brother killed. So there's a depth of detail that a lot of the records we have from the First World War don't necessarily give us. So as many of you will probably know, the service records, 2/3 of which were destroyed during the Second World War. So these perhaps act as a worthy substitute for some of those. The project is also aiming to make these records more accessible. So on Discovery now, you're unable to search them, you're unable to search individuals, whereas now researchers can find names, they can search by condition, they can search by units, they can search by hospitals, all on Discovery, and there'll be a brief bit of information about them. So this is making it much, much, much more accessible than they previously have been. There's a large number of individuals and names, which is obviously of great interest. They're very name-rich sources. we can link them. We can link these records with other records that we have here. So the censuses, we can link them with medal cards, which we do sometimes while we're researching individuals for the cataloguing. So those are really interesting. Like I said, when the 1921 census comes out in a few years' time, we'll be able to track certain individuals, track whether or not they survived, what their outcomes were. So that'll be absolutely fascinating. And it's a major resource for medical humanities and historians. It's not just medicine that is of interest here. We've got insights into social history, for example, thinking about the priest with a relic. So this is a major resource. It's been underused actually in the research for medical history of the First World War, and because it's so inaccessible. So I hope that our work on this project will be able to mean that researchers can utilise this collection, and we can improve our understanding of the medical side of the First World War, which is extremely important. And future plans. So we've already uploaded, as I said, 14,000 individuals onto Discovery. We're going to continue doing that. We're going to hopefully do some further publicity, do some more talks, get people interested in this, continue the legacy of the centenary commemorations of the war. We're hoping to do some blogs and articles as well for the National Archives website. And we are hoping to do a second phase to complete all of the medical case sheets that at the moment we're unable to catalogue. So I just wanted to have Emma talk some final thoughts about the First World War and about medical history in the First World War. I think there's a natural focus when we think of World War I on huge casualty lists, which is completely understandable. Lots of people were killed during the First World War, but there were many wounded men who were wounded who came home. They were treated successfully. They survived. And I think this is a testament to the dedication of the medical profession during the First World War, the hard work that men and women put in. And I hope that the work that we're doing in the MH106 project can help us better understand that legacy. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Have we any questions, please? Right, Alan will come with the microphone. Just give him a moment.
As I live in Aldershot, we've got the Cambridge Military Hospital, which has been in on the telly. That was absolutely ginormous. So, I mean, the amount of records, I presume you've got all their records, but it's absolutely colossal. It must take you, actually going through all the different. I know how much trouble it was trying to get my father's medical records when he was when he was in the Navy during the war. But there's no. I had quite a job to write to the National Health Service to get permission to do it. There's no such thing because it's First World War, is it?
Yeah.
Because over 100 years.
Yeah. So another challenge that perhaps I didn't touch on is the hospitals themselves. So there were so many hospitals. Some of them were so huge. They had subsidiary, auxiliary hospitals. Working out where these were, working out what general base hospitals they were connected to is a real challenge, and sometimes we just can't do that. The Red Cross provides us with a list of VAD, voluntary aid detachment hospitals, which is very useful, but often the records themselves will just provide you with a place name. So it's occasionally quite difficult to work out where people have been. Cambridge does come up a lot. There was one of the Eastern General Hospitals was in Cambridge. But again, as I said, it's not necessarily clear if they were treated at an auxiliary hospital. Patients seem to move around quite a lot. So that's one of the major challenges, is working out where people have been treated.
Sorry, I meant the Cambridge Military Hospital, which is in Aldershot.
Oh, the military hospital, oh, my mistake, sorry.
Thank you. Anybody else? Right, down the front. Well, midway.
At one of our previous visits in York,
Great Hobbit near you now. Near your mouth?
Near my mouth, right, you can hear me now. At one of our previous seminars in York, we went to the Railway Museum, and in there they had some nursing carriages from the First World War, you know, the nursing carriages that were on the front line and then brought round. Do you know if there's any records that would be surviving from that era? Or?
We actually, I've neglected to mention, we do have records of nurses. We have medical case sheets from nurses who were wounded and treated. But we haven't started cataloguing those, so it's not clear which institutions they're treated at. I don't believe we have any I don't believe we have any ambulance trains. It will be hospitals behind. Well, it will be set. The way the records are separated are just by the units that these women were serving in, so they could have been treated anywhere. But as far as I understand, we won't have anything specifically dedicated to hospital trains, unfortunately.
And you wouldn't know where any of those kind of records would be kept?
I'm not sure, I'm afraid, no.
The genealogist has some lists. There's a very small sample, not genealogy, Forces War Records, I think, of the ambulance trains. It's a very small sample that was kept, but it doesn't say any more on those records than you see on the originals here, the ones I've checked anyway.
And what I'll be staying behind after, so if you'd like, I could give you my contact details and we can try and work it out as well.
Thank you.
Super, thank you very much. Any more questions? Right, Alan left, please.
Hello and thank you. This is a bit of an aside, but I've been looking at my daughter-in-law's family, discovered that she had a sort of cousin so many times removed, who qualified as a doctor in Scotland, volunteered to serve, you know, on the front line.
Yep.
Was refused, so the suffragette movement in Scotland actually paid for medical staff to go down to serve
yes. So nurse, is that nurses or is that just
doctors and nurses?
Doctors and nurses.
Well,
oh, interesting.
At least one doctor.
Yeah.
They were put to work as sort of ward orderlies.
Yeah, orderlies. Yeah.
Rebelled, volunteered to help the French medical services, and this doctor in particular finished up being sent to Yugoslavia.
Oh wow!
Founding, staying there, founding a women and children's hospital, and I discovered about a month ago the Yugoslav government. Well, she went to Serbia, but Yugoslavian government actually issued a set of stamps with the volunteers' portraits.
Interesting. I didn't know about that at all. Unfortunately, we don't actually. There isn't a focus on the medical staff themselves.
Yes.
We get the names, so doctors would routinely sign off treatments. But the focus of these records is the patients, and that's simply because we don't have any information about who was which medical staff were working where. But it would be really.
Sorry?
What's that? Sorry.
The Wellcome Institute have quite a number of records about doctors and where they're similar.
Ah, okay. So the Wellcome Trust will have some of that information.
Yes, and a lot of the doctors is online, but I'm sure they'll pick up on the indexing project anyway, won't they? You would think they're funding it, you would expect so. Any more? All right. Any?
Yeah. I just wanted to clarify, presumably you look at these in conjunction with the regimental war diaries to see exactly what engagements were going on.
We don't do that systematically.
You haven't done that, because that would be a really interesting thing to do.
So what we do yesterday, what a colleague and I did, is we worked out, we tried to work out where one individual had served, because we couldn't actually read what was written on the sheet. So it gives us the information of where he served, but we had to turn to the war diaries, but systematically we're not doing that, I'm afraid.
I mean, that would be a wonderful project for someone to do, wouldn't it?
It would be, yeah, it would be fascinating. I mean, that's what I think that's one of the next stages, not of this project, but what this will allow researchers to do is to connect these records to the war diaries and to all of the other First World War records that we have at the National Archives.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I was thinking about the guild members, you know, because a lot of you within your research projects have already done a World War I element, haven't you? So if you latch on to one of the names in here, I'm sure you would be able to embellish this. Well, embellish sounds as though you're making it up, doesn't it? Yeah, don't mean that.
Yes, exactly. So we can, obviously the service records do not survive for that many individuals. And so, as I've said, these would be quite a good substitute. They have quite a lot of information. So if you're able to find records of someone in our medal cards, if you're able to find them in the war diary, if you can find them in MH106, then that should give you quite a lot of information about that individual and the treatment they received.
You said that you're not indexing the admission and discharge books at
We're
this
not,
point. No. Could that be a future project?
I'm not so sure. I'm not sure the Wellcome Trust would be able to provide us with the resources to do that, simply because their main interest is making accessible content for the medical humanities, but I'm not ruling it out. But that's not within the scope of this project at the moment, I'm afraid.
So I think I was at 1.3 million names. I think we might be quite interested.
Yeah, I thought you would. I thought you would, and I was as I said, I do encourage you to come in and have a look at them, but sadly, no, we're not cataloguing those yet.
It sounds a wonderful project that's beginning to open the door to something else, isn't it? Some of these records are obviously going to be harrowing. We've already seen that, but it is meaningful to get that detail, isn't it? And to understand, and you know, for the overall understanding of the First World War and the situations and the psychology and mental health and so on. This will no doubt greatly add to it.
Sorry to interrupt you. Mental health, actually, I quite like to say something about. It's an interesting one, and you can see the struggles that the medical profession were having with mental health bear out in the records themselves. So I came across one record which it doesn't seem to have an official name, but it's a form for when a serviceman came in with some kind of mental injury. And what it seems that they're trying to determine is whether or not they can pinpoint a cause. So has someone got shell shock? And because we have a visible cause, we can say they were shot and they've now got shell shock, or a shell exploded near them and they've now got shell shock, or have they got shell shock and there appears to be no cause. So the medical profession were trying to distinguish between the two. In fact, they were distinguishing between the two because it influenced what type of pension you got if you were unable to continue your service. If you were classed as having shell shock as a wound, which would have been from a shell burst, for example, then you would be able to receive a full pension. But as far as I understand, it might affect whether or not you can claim a pension if there's no determinable cause of your shell shock, if you've just been traumatized by all of the experiences you've seen rather than having a specific event happen to you. And that's bared out in the records. It's really interesting. Just seeing that struggle to work out what was going on, that I suppose still continues.
Quite, yes indeed. So, if that's all the questions, right. Can I thank John very much?
Oh, thank you very much.